Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think many of you have been here for most of the day, so we're winding down, and I just have a few remarks before we jump into the artist conversation. So my name is Roz, and I am an associate curator of programs here. I'm also a queer, non-binary artist and educator that is so thrilled to be able to offer a day like this to our community. So I'm grateful for you all being here. I also gave a lot of thanks early in the morning, and I want to give a few more thanks right now. First, I want to thank all of our staff who have made this possible on a Saturday, all the various things that go into that. I know we're all happy and thankful for that, so thank you to our staff. And I also want to extend a sort of deep gratitude to Lisa Doran, who is our deputy director at the museum, and Pam Franks, who's our class of 1956 director of the museum. And they are both tireless advocates for events like this, the kind of exhibition that we have upstairs right now, the artists and curators who make it possible, and in particular, these kinds of events that make people feel seen and heard and appreciated. So I just want to give them a round of applause. Thank you. So if you weren't here earlier, I wanted to repeat myself in saying that exhibitions like Teddy Sandoval and the Butch Garden School of Art let museums use their status as a center of power to honor those most impacted by state violence and other forms of cruelty. And they offer a platform, an opportunity for people to come together and gather around topics like what we've been exploring today. And this kind of dialogue and togetherness is such an important part of liberal arts education, and it really embodies the values that we have here at WICMA. This is our final event of the day, and we have lots of other events coming up throughout the fall. This is our last semester of programming in Lawrence Hall. You may have heard WICMA is getting a new building. We're opening in 2027, and so we're sort of tapering off and also having a really robust final semester. So please keep coming back. We will have a celebration or a film screening in collaboration with Visual Aids at Images on World AIDS Day, December 1st. So hopefully you can come and join us for that and find more information online. Finally, I'm going to introduce Mari Rodriguez Binnie, who is here to moderate the conversation with the artists. Mari is an associate professor of art history here at Williams and a contributor to the exhibition catalog, which I see many of you have already got. If you haven't gotten it yet, this is the place to get it in the United States right now. So go grab it from our gift shop. I've heard Joey is signing publications. Even has a stamp from, what year is your stamp from? 1974 stamp. Really special opportunity. So with that, Mari. Yes, Mari.
Thank you. I guess I don't have to use this. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ross, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be celebrating the opening of Teddy Sandoval and the Butch Garden School of Art. And I am thrilled to be here in conversation with three of the artists whose work is featured in the show. Joey Terrill, Troy Montes-Michie, and Moises Salazar Tlatenchi. I will introduce our artists very quickly, and I will also do it very quickly because the catalog that has been mentioned so far includes biographies for all the artists, so it's also another reason to check out this wonderful publication. The biographies also have selected bibliographies and exhibition history, so it's a wonderful resource. So get it while you can. Okay, so I will give a brief biographical sketch for our first speaker today, Joey Terrill. Joey, of course, as the exhibition shows, was a very close friend and collaborator of Teddy Sandoval, and in his own right, of course, was an integral part of a group of Chicano artists who in the 70s and 80s created works that diverged from traditional Chicano-based imagery and subject matter, and in Joey's case, to reflect his queered lived experiences. And the long arc of Joey's career has been the subject of the recent solo exhibitions at Parkview and Pol Soto in Los Angeles in 2022, and at Ortisar Projects in New York in 2021. His work has also been included in several surveys, and I'm just going to mention here, of course, Access Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano, LA, brought to us by the same curators as Teddy Sandoval and the Butch Garden School of Art, David Evans-France and Ondine Chaboya. And his work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, El Museo del Barrio, the Hammer Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and of course right here at WICMA. Joey also is recently retired as the Director of Global Advocacy and Partnerships for the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and he lives and works in Los Angeles. Our second speaker is Troy Montes-Michie. Troy was raised in El Paso, Texas, and he received his BFA from the University of Texas at El Paso and his MFA from the Yale School of Art. His work was most recently featured in a solo exhibition at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston. And his work has also been included in group exhibitions at the Whitney Museum, at the Shed, at the New Museum, the VCU Institute of Contemporary Art, the Metropolitan Arts Center Belfast, the New Museum, and the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston and the Studio Museum in Harlem. His work is a part of the collections of the Whitney Museum and the Ulster Museum in Belfast, and Troy lives and works in New York. And our third speaker, Moises Salazar Tlatenchi, is a non-binary artist based in Chicago, and Tlatenchi holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And their work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, National Museum of Mexican Art, and the John Michael Kohler Art Center. So the way that I have envisioned this conversation, so it's taking a cue really from the exhibition itself. The exhibition, of course, is bringing in all of these different collaborations, right? In addition to contextualizing the work of Teddy Sandoval, it's bringing in all of these collaborations and also contemporaneous affinities between Teddy and other artists in other geographies, and then extending these affinities across time. And so it's very fitting that today's conversation, therefore, has a cross-section of these artists, right? So we have Joey and Troy and Moises to then speak about their individual works first, and then we will place them in conversation much in the spirit of the exhibition itself. And so we will have brief presentations by each of the artists, and then we will all go to the stage and have a conversation, and we'll open it up to a Q&A. So without further ado, I will cede the floor to Joey. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure about the slides. Right. Perfect, thank you. Okay, hi everybody, thanks for being here. So as you probably already know, Teddy Sandoval and I were, partners in crime, collaborators, best friends. I loved him dearly, and we used to, relish engaging with each other about how to create queer Chicano art. And we came up with this idea of doing a version of an identity called maricón, which was a slur that we decided to, take back and empower ourselves with. So we did this maricón photo series, in which I was the model, and so that's me. And I made this T-shirt that said Maricon, and Teddy took these images, and his photography was fantastic, and it was used in mail art. But at that same time as he was doing work, I also worked on an art piece in a magazine format called Homeboy Beautiful. And it was a total parody of upper middle class magazines like House Beautiful, Cosmopolitan, all of the magazines that I used to look at and never saw Chicano images or queer images. And it was done tongue in cheek. It was done with humor. And again, that's me on the cover, the first issue, Homeboy, with an expose on homo homeboys, okay? And then the middle one is the second volume that I did, and the expose was on East LA terrorism. And and I was borrowing from like tabloids like Alarma, The Inquirer, and again having fun with it. I was starting to work on a third one, which is over all the way to the right, and it was going to be Homeboys in the Arts. And I was trying to figure out what to do, but long story short, my personal life interfered, and I moved to New York, and so that was never done. But I wanted to point out that in the Homeboy Beautiful magazine, which there are pages and here in this exhibit, it covered a wide range of arenas or topics. So there was an advice column called Ask Little Loca, okay, and it was from the perspective of being a chola, right? Part of the gang subculture, and in it, she gives advice on makeup. She also someone writes in and is talking about somebody that she doesn't like, and what can she do because this girl is really terrible, whatever. And she says, "I'll tell you what you can do. You can watch out for yourself because that's my cousin and I'm coming to kick your ass," right? So it was again very, very tongue in cheek. There was also fashion tips for the new bandana ties for spring. And you see how depending on how you adjusted your bandana, because at that time, the whole image of the cholo was using bandanas. So then the expose, I played a photojournalist named Santos, and I said I took a camera and I snuck into a midnight homeboy party, a secret party in East LA. And I took these pictures secretly, and it showed homeboys making out and kissing, and at midnight they took off the 45s, the oldies but goodies, and they put on the Judy Garland records, and so. And I also had at a certain point there, they took their bandanas off their foreheads and stuck them in either their left or right side pockets, following the hanky codes of gay culture at the time. And of course, as I'm reporting on this, I was saying I was totally disgusted, and I promised I'm just going to do one more dance and then I'm leaving. And then this was part of the photo shoot as well for the Maricon series. There were about I think a half dozen photos, and we would Xerox these images small and put them on postcards that became part of the mail art that we would do and send them out to London, Canada, San Francisco, LA. I don't think we sent one here, but anyway, and there again. And I'll just say on a personal note or whatever, when I was 15, my uncle, my mom, my cousin, we drove to Mexico City from LA, and it was an eye-opener for me. It was really the first time that I engaged with my Mexican heritage in a way that, growing up in East LA was fairly limited. And the one thing that we did on that trip, my mom bought this blanket, which I intentionally used as the backdrop for these photos, and I still have it, and it's one of my favorite things in the world. So, and then along again, the theme of the Maricon identity, for the Gay Pride Parade at that time in LA, it was on Hollywood Boulevard, I decided to make T-shirts that said Maricon. So these are all hand done. And I essentially asked my friends, anyone who's interested in wearing one, I'll make one for you, but you got to promise to wear it in March. And all the way on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a woman who's looking away, and that's my cousin Pat, she's a lesbian in the family, and we're still very close to this day. And that was her partner Martha, standing next to her. And Martha was a friend of mine since high school, and we are still friends to this day. But I made Maflora T-shirts for them. And to be honest, I wasn't sure was it Malflora or Ma Flora, how it was spelled. And I left it up to Martha. She said, I like the term Ma Flora, or bad flower. I said, okay. So it was Ma Flora. And then we had the Maricon t-shirts. And we were a hit in the parade. And I want to state that my intent was to have two audiences. One, it was for the wider, gay, mostly white audience to show, hey, we're here too. We're Latinos and we're part of the gay community or queer community. But it was also to the Chicano and Latino community that, hey, we're queers and we are part of the overall Chicano-Latino diaspora. This was another little photo series. Teddy and I used to collaborate on these little photo series, and this is in front of his studio at the time in downtown LA, and this was called Heartbreak Hotel. And we would do these photo shoots where we were both drunk, supposed to be drunk, in front of the Heartbreak Hotel, and that was a friend of his, Bill Sampson, who was sweeping the street, and we were just considered trash. And that would also be put onto postcards and sent out. So just as another alternative. Then I attended Immaculate Heart College, 73, and was, taught by the students of Sister Karita Kent, and that was why I chose to go there, and because her spirit still permeated the art department, and silk screening was front and center as part of the practice there at Immaculate Heart. And from the start, I was doing silk screens that, for me, I wanted to show gay male images, but particularly Latinos. And this was a counterpoint at that time for both Teddy and I, that we were familiar with all of the other Chicano iconography that was going on, where there was a sense of, to be Chicano was to be sort of, macho and, and standing there, defiant and sort of, que viva la raza and the fists and all of that. And I instead wanted to show men being gentle or kind or sweet or sexy or having sex. But the one on the left is, on the one on the, on the left is called Dormido. And then the one on the right is called En la Cantina. And I'll just share with you that the image source for En la Cantina was actually from Women's Wear Daily. Back in the early 70s, Women's Wear Daily did an article on the new club, or mid-70s, a new club called Studio 54, and they had this image of two men sitting on the floor talking with each other, and I borrowed that to turn into En la Cantina. There were other silk screens that I was doing at that time as well, which to me had a queer sensibility. The one on the left is based on, it was a woman in a bathing suit, but it's called Basura de la Playa, or the trash at the beach. And then on the one on the right was Beach Ball. And again, I was looking at brown bodies and doing minimal details. I was very interested in the graphics and the way that one could just take shape and color, and also a lack of ink or color to create spaces within the context of the work. So this was very different from most of the work that was being done at Immaculate Heart at that time. But so these are from 1975. But then I was also doing painting, and this is a painting called Robert Resting After Work. And again, I'll point out that here is the blanket that you saw as the backdrop for the black and white Maricon photo series. And this was my partner at the time, Robert Ward, who, I loved him dearly, and I still do. He's a good friend. But again, I wanted to show the male Latino being sort of, serene, and here actually was resting after work. I always worked from photos, and my intent was to create this sort of cartoon imagery. So I was looking at eliminating detail, eliminating dark or deep shadows, and that's what I did. So this is Robert Resting After Work, 1987 to 88. And this is another painting that I did called Orlando Waiting for Toast. And it's from 1999 to 2000. And this was my roommate at the time, Orlando Alamillo. And I used to carry a camera with me around, 35 millimeter wherever I went, even around the house, and would just take pictures and photographs. And I'd go out on the street and I'd like, oh, there's a dead rat, I'd take a picture, or there's some roses, I'll take a picture. Because I always knew that I wanted to have images that I could then borrow to make paintings of. And I came upon Orlando as he was waiting for toast. And I thought it made for a good moment. And I think it looked kind of sexy too. So then this is jumping ahead. This is called Woof, and that's me over on the right holding up an image of a young Matt Dillon in the magazine, the Interview magazine at the time, Andy Warhol's Interview. And then my friend Eddie, who I went to high school with, is standing over to my right with the sunglasses. And we were in San Francisco visiting our friend Daniel. And Daniel was someone that we used to all hang out with in the 70s in LA, but he moved to San Francisco. And because he did, we always had a place to crash when we went to San Francisco. And we would go and we would party, stay out all night, come in at 5 in the morning, and just really had the best time ever. There were about 8 of us, 8 to 10, that all went to Cathedral High School, Catholic boys' school. We all sort of came out together around the same time or shortly after graduation, and we all connected and hung together, and we called ourselves Las Escandalosas, or we shortened it to SCON. So we would greet each other like, hey, Big SCON, come on, let's all go to San Francisco. But at this particular moment in time, things were changing. It was already, the 1980s. AIDS had already started decimating the community. And so instead of going up and, going out and partying and doing some drugs and whatever, it changed. So we'd go up there to visit with Danny, who was already a little sick. So we would get together and, make a dinner, a meal. We'd watch old movies and sort of, be there to support him. And as we were doing that, I was looking through the Interview magazine, and I opened it up, and there was like this picture of Matt Dillon, and Danny, Eddie, and I, all 3 of us said, woof, all at the same time. So I said, okay, I need to make that into a painting. Then this is another painting from 1989 called Remembrance. And this was a painting that I chose to do because I wanted to portray the grief, the grieving that we were going through with so many friends dying from AIDS. I was already an AIDS activist. I was joining in demonstrations in California, going to Washington, joining in with ACT UP. I was never a member of ACT UP, but I was one of the people that would follow the trajectory going up to Sacramento, DC, or LA. But I was familiar with and really appreciated the art that was coming out of the AIDS crisis. So the agitprop of ACT UP, Grand Fury, loved it, but I wanted to do something that wasn't that political. It was more about those of us who were remembering our friends. And I chose to do this in a setting that I think is at the same time beautiful, but also perhaps a little threatening, because you don't want to fall back on all that cactus and stuff. I'm also holding a bouquet of gladiolas and birds of paradise. And for those that don't know, the bird of paradise is the official flower of Los Angeles. So, and the person behind me, again, was my partner at the time, Robert. And I chose to pose him behind me, and because he was about 9 years younger, and his generation hadn't had all the loss quite yet. He was assisting me with grieving for my friends, and so we chose to let him be behind me, showing his support of me coming up. The other thing I'll point out about this painting is that the shirt that I'm wearing was one of my favorite shirts, and it was designed by Arnubal Raika, Arnie, who was a friend of mine at the time, and he was very sick. And I remember him coming in as I was finishing the painting, and he said, "I'm so glad you did my design." Because he knew, he said, "I'm not going to be around longer, but my design will live on." And I said, "Well, yeah," and he was correct. Today, this is in the collection of the Hammer. So, here's another painting that I did in 1992-93. For 3 years in a row, from 89 to 91, I had Halloween parties in which I would take 2 weeks to decorate the interior of my house, dining room, and blank stock the walls and put up drawings and collage and paintings and really made it an immersive environment. And without it being spoken out loud, everyone knew that if you were going to my house for the party, it didn't matter how sick you were, it didn't matter what your condition was, you knew you could go there and just enjoy and celebrate, and you would totally be supportive, where you couldn't necessarily do that going out to a bar or a club or whatever. And so this is Jeff, Victor, Luis, and George, and I'll point out that Jeff, all the way on the left, okay, and then Luis with the white roses in his hair, they're still together, they're friends of mine and they're partners, but they came dressed as the painting Dos Fridas, which I just thought was brilliant. If everyone's familiar with that painting, you know, that's a double self-portrait, and she has her heart with veins of blood connecting them as they're holding hands. And you can kind of see with Jeff, he's got that velvet red heart there on his chest, and there's just it was plastic, red plastic tubing that became the veins of blood. And so every now and then we'd say, okay, let's pose, and they would sit just like the painting. And then Victor Durazo was in the middle there with his white wig, and he was a great friend of mine as well. So, then this is another painting from the Halloween series called Tom Gutierrez. And Tom was a very, you know, handsome, friendly, great smile, athletic, Italian, Mexican, and you know, he was already getting sick, and the year after this painting, he had already died. And that was one of the things. After the third Halloween party, I stopped having them because, you know, you could look at the photos and the imagery from the first one, and then the following year, it's like, oh, they're no longer here. And then by the third party, it was like, wow, yeah, they're dropping like flies. But again, it was a celebratory rebuke to all of the pain and suffering and stigma and homophobia and AIDS phobia that we were all having to deal with at that time. And here again from the Halloween series, this is Oscar Ernesto. And you know, here you get an indication of the way I would collage all the background and the walls. And you know, for those that are wondering, the skulls and the lily are actual copies of Robert Mapplethorpe photographs. And there's also imagery by Baron von Gloden and Maxfield Parrish, and then some scenes from Fellini's Satyricon. But there's also the painting in the gold frame, which is actually part of this exhibit here. And that was a gift to me from Teddy, which I cherish, and I'm so glad that it's here, part of the exhibit. So this was 92 to 93. Then in 1996, I tested undetectable for HIV for the very first time. Up until that point, I always thought I was going to die from AIDS. I mean, that was in my head. There was no reason for me to think otherwise. All of my friends were dying. Some of them were on the same medications that I was, and they were having difficulties and problems. And so I wanted to try to figure out, how do I portray in art my ambivalence about being alive during the age of the AIDS cocktail. I couldn't think of one photographic source like I had for all my other paintings. And it was one day as I was sitting at my breakfast table with my meds and my box of Cheerios, and I said, gee, this looks like a Tom Wesselmann still life. I thought, that's it. I'm going to do my versions of Tom Wesselmann still lifes, but I'm going to queerize and Mexicanize them. And so, you know, every one that I do, I start out with the same recipe. The tabletop is foregrounded with the Mexican blanket, and then I just, you know, juxtapose a variety of items and things that might be familiar but don't necessarily correlate or go together. You know, what does a bagel have to do with this big phallic, you know, cucumber? I also wanted to inject humor and a lot of sexual innuendo, which I did. This is Still Life with Crixivan, and there's actually 4 pills of Crixivan you can see there in the foreground. And Crixivan was a drug that I took as an experimental at the time, clinical trial, and I had severe side effects from. I lost all the hair on my legs, and it's never returned, so I'm very smooth. But I also had really severe kidney stones. And, and when the doctor told me, well, that pain is second only to women giving childbirth, I was like, you know what, I had a whole new appreciation for women, really, truly. The other thing is that my partner Rick, back in the early 80s, we used to hang wall covering. We would go and get these jobs that designers would assign us to as paper hangers in all these big mansions and homes throughout Beverly Hills, Palos Verdes, Santa Barbara, Montecito, high-end jobs. There'd be 50 rolls of paper. And I was very aware that this was entree into these homes and that level of society that I would otherwise never have a social connection to. But there would inevitably be a roll of paper left over, and sometimes 2. And the designer or the client would say, oh, just toss them. And I would say, oh my God, no, this paper is so beautiful. I said, do you mind, can I take it? They said, oh, take it. So I said, one day I'm going to figure out how to use these in art. I could never figure it out, and I carried them around with me for 15 years, from studio to garage to house. And then finally, when I started to do the Still Life series, I said, aha, I'm going to do these fake, domestic settings and use real wallpaper in these very surreal, domestic settings. And I've continued to do them over the years, okay? And this is, and the series has evolved. This is Still Life with Triamec and wrapped candies that remind me of the artist Felix Gonzalez Torres. And you see there the Triamec. It's a combination therapy. It's 1 pill a day. I went from taking 12 pills a day. But I'm also now starting to do the series where I'm honoring individuals and artists who died from AIDS. So this is now in the collection at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. Then I'm going to end quickly here with this diptych, Just What Is It About Today's Homos That Makes Them So Different, So Appealing? And for those that don't know, or if you haven't seen, this is in the collection of this museum. And it's there if you want to go see it. And I'll be more than happy to talk about all of it. There's all these intersections of sexual innuendo, historic references, and pop art. And yeah, so that's my story. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be brief, but thank you all for having me. I wanted to do something a little bit untraditional, so the 2 pieces might be hard because I was hoping they'd be playing. This first one, it's called This Is Where I Draw the Line, and I created it in 2021, and it starts off as kind of like probably like 20 inches high, but its length is about 34 feet. And then the other one that you might see, I think once I start talking a little bit more, is this is also a series of different works that are titled Riots, June 3rd through June 8th, 1943. And the reason why I kind of wanted to show both of these is I think a huge part of my artistic practice kind of really delved into this history of Pachuquismo. But in a way, it almost kind of felt like a derail in that I was still kind of working with a lot of men's magazines, but during that time of the election, I felt compelled to really say something about border culture, being from El Paso, Texas, just because of a lot of the mistruths that were being spread by a person we all know by this point. So I think in terms of my practice, let me see, I put some notes. or I guess on the train, I started to think a little bit about drawing. I teach drawing full-time at Princeton. And drawing is something that has always come naturally to me since I was a kid. I was just kind of obsessed with almost, I guess, the seeming simplicity, but it is, for me, a medium that's very much about building. And kind of through these different memories of drawing, I often feel I would like to tell myself I was an easy kid to raise, but I was just so enamored with drawing for hours, where I'm sure my parents loved it. It's like, oh, he'll draw for 5 hours, just give him some crayons. But I think with a lot of my work, even on this new project I'm starting now, it always comes from a place of the familial. So the reason why I was bringing up the train ride is I started to think about my grandmother, who had a huge part in raising me. But she was an avid Sunday paper reader, and she would always give me the comics page, which I was most excited about, to see Family Circus. But I think it was almost this way of just kind of keeping me busy too, with just kind of these different papers to draw over. And I have this brief memory of being really interested in trying to change the photographs in the newspaper headlines, almost as like a trick. So then I'd like go in and draw over the different photographs with graphite and erasers, and then I'd fold those pages back up and then slip them in to see if maybe somebody would notice that the image didn't match the headline. And it's kind of interesting because I still think a lot about the media, the news in these days, and the frame, especially with collage. I think so much of collage is about the gaze, the frame, and also kind of thinking about the photograph. I've always been somebody who's interested in kind of the full scene. What is the photograph not showing because we're only seeing kind of the cropping through that one particular photographer's lens. And I think a lot about touch in my work. I don't know if it sounds weird, but kind of going through the archive, I work in different ways now in terms of going to libraries or different research institutes, but my first initial archive was just kind of going through my grandmother's closet, and I really just enjoyed that experience of being able to hold photographs, being able to sit with them. I would often draw from them, and they were never really organized, so it was this idea of just kind of scavenging through these memories, but also just being struck as a child about, the passage of time, because I couldn't imagine that my family looked that way in those photographs compared to the people that I knew during my lifetime. But I think that's kind of where a lot of the thinking still kind of comes up. With this one long zipper piece, I kind of wanted to show this one because it shows kind of all the different ways of collaging that I've worked in. When I first started collage, I had kind of stepped out of oil painting. I was a trained oil painter, and I wanted to be a drawing major, I remember now, but it seemed, being from El Paso, not knowing very many artists, I almost felt like if I majored in drawing, I would have no career. It seemed like this huge decision, so then I was like, okay, I'll be a painter. And so I was really into doing portraits of my family. But around the time I was able to go to Yale Norfolk before I went to Yale for grad school, that was a huge moment for me to kind of be introduced with more contemporary art at that level, but I had also realized, I can do whatever I want. Collage is definitely an art form. I don't have to be a painter. And so from there, I slowly just kind of stepped away from it. I do think a lot of my work is within kind of the canon of mixed media painting, but a lot of it, I think, implies this sense of touch. And so everything I do in my studio gets touched, it gets sewn over, it gets drawn over. I don't really treat them very preciously. I work on the floor and the wall. But I think with the zipper piece, one of my early critiques in grad school was, you're Rauschenberg, which I was like, okay. Yes, he's from Texas. Yes, he's also queer. But, oh, sorry. For me, I don't know, it would just become a thing on and on. And so I saw one of his retrospectives at MoMA, maybe like a decade ago or more. And I was struck by a piece of his called Hiccups, which was this series of prints that are zipped together, no frame, no kind of hard substrate. And from there, this zipper piece kind of became like my like inside joke of like, okay, you want to call me Rauschenberg? I'm going to take on a Rauschenberg piece, but I'm going to make it my own. But through working on this long zipper piece, it really just started to make sense with everything that I had been researching on the zoot suit work. I had worked with local zoot suit tailors in El Paso, but I also enjoyed kind of the addition of the zipper. So these panels can be unzipped and reconfigured. They haven't been, but that was kind of my initial intention. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. And then these more black and white works, because there was only, I guess, a limited amount of them, I wanted each one to kind of focus on one day of the Zoot Suit riots. So as they start to progress, I start to include a little bit more imagery and form. It's not a direct kind of relation in terms of a lot of the imagery of what was occurring during the riots, but I was just really struck by its history in that it's one of the first riots kind of blamed for an article of clothing. If a lot of you aren't familiar with the zoot suit, after it was made illegal, people would get jail time for wearing the suit. Tailors were not allowed to make it. So during that time from 2016 till 2021, this kind of became just like a huge symbol for me to kind of work along the lines of all these things that I'm interested in terms of marginalized histories that get erased. I was interested in just kind of a certain kind of labor that can be considered domestic. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that I got the invitation and I'm excited to talk about my work. So I am first generation non-binary from Chicago, and my work has predominantly been influenced by my lived experience. And I always kind of overall try to look at my practice as a form of making work for my inner child, but also work for children that have similar experiences, as I did growing up sort of in this unstable country that very much criminalizes undocumented families, and having undocumented ancestors and sort of my legacy being criminalized kind of pushed me in this place where I feel grateful to be here. Having the rights as a U.S. American, but I'm very angry at a lot of the experiences that I have to go through and that my parents have to go through. So I always start off with this image of almost like this moment of expansiveness that, this just almost like Catholic imagery of my mom holding me with my siblings, but just the potential there is so immense for me, especially as a queer child looking back. So I was trained as an oil painter, and around the same time that I was sort of losing, or I guess like coming to terms with losing love of this material that is so removed from my identity, I was coming out as non-binary. And that sort of transformative time was so intense for me because I was letting go of a lot of the things I found appreciative of myself. So some of these, like, looking back, toxic examples of masculinity within gay, culture. And I arrived at this place where I made my first glitter painting, and it was just a activated moment for me that I have always been obsessed with, like from that point on. And I think that glitter as a material that is always stigmatized is like a perfect way to sort of talk about visually of like queer communities, because it's something that I feel like this people have a strong reaction to. It will always shine and reflect light. It fragments, and I think that it gets everywhere. And that resilience, I guess, like I find kind of beautiful. And it is, my work is definitely a place for me to sort of deal with my own insecurities about my body, about how I'm perceived, and safety. So my first pieces were sort of meant to just represent a confidence that I didn't feel. Like I didn't live that confidence, and I think that I'm a part of the generation that you're supposed to like love yourself, like immediately, and sometimes you don't know how that's done. And I couldn't live that, so I just began kind of surrounding myself with how I wanted to present, how I wanted to feel, and that sort of using drag and kind of myself as a template to model these paintings, but also it was my way of playing with this visual language that I was coming up with. And I think that I find beautiful similarities even with the work upstairs of sort of this silhouette, because at least for me, it has always been intentionally so anyone can see themselves in these works. Obviously, like these bodies are brown and I am of Mexican descent, but in the beginning, I was kind of focused on like, I don't want these to have gender, as I was even thinking about my own bodies and what I possess, and removing all of that away from gender. And I think that I play a lot with sort of taking ownership of imagery that, of all these cultures that I'm a part of. And as someone that sort of, you always have to deal with the realities of this country, I never felt like I could take ownership of it, or that I was almost like I'm borrowing this land. And I think that now I sort of, my work is supposed to be almost like this glamorous liberation. Like that's how it feels, and I try to center sort of sensuality and create spaces where these figures can be safe, as safety was not part of my upbringing. And being raised Catholic, I almost felt like I had to suppress a lot of myself, and I think that I was raised in a generation where out of safety or out of fear, I was kind of meant to mute myself, not stand out, follow in line, don't cause any trouble, don't look crazy. And I think that in my work, I'm kind of making up for it. Like that's why I tend to have this, people describe it as like maximalist, I guess, but it's like I love adorning. I love sort of, that's my way of showing love, and I'm attracted to these kind of craft materials that my mom taught me. Like I crochet, I use yarn, I use a lot of ceramic. My dad used to lay ceramic blocks in Puebla, Mexico, and obviously glitter. And sort of a lot of these textiles and sequining and sewing have been sort of my way of playing with creating this sort of safe environment for my figures. And that has recently sort of expanded on how do I sort of, I kind of told myself like, okay, I am depicting sort of these safe spaces, but how do I actively create these spaces? So when I've had the chance to do kind of these immersive exhibitions, I try to do sort of the most, And this specific work was on creating this sort of gym. As I was sort of dealing with my own body, I kept thinking like, what does it mean to sort of, be the perfect version of yourself? Or like, why do we put this pressure to be healthier? The trajectory of me working out, changes my body based on my own body dysmorphia, in the sense of being non-binary or removed from gender. So, and I think that aspect of play is universal. Like I've always wanted to create work that is one visually sort of easy to ease into, even though it's like it's super intense. But I always want my audience to feel like they can take ownership and they can sort of be a part of it. So all the equipment was sort of, everyone was invited to use the equipment. I like transformed all of it. I kept thinking like the treadmill as like a catwalk. Like I think that there's so much repression in society to sort of go against play. And to me, that's what queerness is. Like that magic of going into my first time going to see drag, or at clubs or nightlife. It was about playing. It's about dress up. It's about sort of presenting yourself. And I think that's something that's universal. And I always find myself trying to recreate that in my work. And I was raised Catholic, and I think that I still see some beautiful relationships between sort of the Mexican altars that I grew up seeing and the music. It's the music, it's the lighting, it's these sculptures, it's these paintings. To me, that was the first moments that I had with art, and I find myself using my practice to do the same. So I love overwhelming people as someone that, to me, this is just, I do it with my materials, with the scale. In this specific piece, it was like a love letter to the Chicago queer community. You have sort of like the underbelly of the fire, the sexiness or like of that nightlife culture. But then in the earth, here's a friend of mine who's a boxer who teaches femme folks how to box and safe femme spaces and curators and activists and drag queens and drag performers. So it's like I try to create all this language that is, again, borrowing from all these spheres of influence that I have, that instead of sort of hating on, it's like I want to take ownership of. And it's my way of healing myself. And at the center of it is a portrait actually of my little brother. Because to me, again, going back to the first photo, it's like that is the moment of expansiveness, or like, the potential to me is what I'm always trying to sort of create work on. And that sort of potential and that childlike quality is like something that I've seen throughout my practice, and I could kind of draw a line. And it's something that I use a lot, especially in this body of work. This series is called Cuerpos Desechables. It's an ongoing body of work that kind of creates these forms of piñatas, and I've presented them in a variety of spaces. They're kind of meant to comment on the fact that children are seen as the archetype of innocent, but yet there's children detained at the border. There's children now in detention centers. And the fact that my parents were criminalized for what they did were children when they crossed the border. So in this specific project, I was able to go to Mexico, Puebla, Mexico for the first time, and I made a pair of piñatas in my parents' homes, and I installed them in spaces that they inhabited and also can no longer go back to. So it's like looking at the responsibilities of me as an artist, but also as a child of them, and also my own sort of reasoning to heal my family through my own practice, and sort of bringing a little bit of them to spaces that they, no longer can be in. So this is in Mexico City. A lot of them were shot in Puebla, and then even in San Isidro, San Diego, Tijuana, in front of the border. And the work is meant to comment on the fact that piñatas are sort of seen as an object that is always going to face immense violence, and destroyed for what's inside of it and then discarded. And I wanted to subvert that narrative. So none of my piñatas are destroyed. They're sort of meant to be kept. And that's kind of how I find myself speaking in regards to the immigrant communities. How do you teach a community that always expects violence, that their response to what goes on is, pues así son las cosas. It's like this acceptance. So, and then they were finally installed at the MCA in Chicago. And then this is another series of, again, talking about the unaccompanied minors in Big Bend National Park, a space that is seen as a beautiful recreation area, but has also been weaponized in Texas. And so many lives have been lost there, and it's like, how do you kind of contest with all these narratives? And I try to use my practice as a way to speak on these things and sort of be at this space of duality of like wanting to celebrate, also wanting to create action and activism, and tell these ancestral stories that are also not ancestral, they're living. It's something that we've talked about this whole week in these past few days of like, these things are happening, and I think it's easy to see these things so removed, but when you're there, when you're in Texas, it's like they're alive. And most recently, and I'll go quickly through this part, but as a lot of my work is done through archival and sort of using images, using, events, I've also been trying to find my own voice within it, because sometimes I could feel that I'm making work for somebody else. And based on this improvised sort of performance I did at the Fire Island residency, I kind of created this deity, this non-binary god, and it's sort of referencing the chinelo, which is a traditional dance in Mexico. And I kept thinking, like, what is a non-binary? Chilenos are usually men, or like they're presenting men. And I was like, what does a non-binary Chileno look like? So again, it's like these faceless figures, and that has inspired sort of an alter ego of creating work that is my own mark, or what does it mean for me to have my own mythics or my own, instead of being an artist that often references things that are happening now or things that, these histories, these colonial histories that already exist, what does it mean for me to make my own language? And that's something that I've been contesting with this past year. And I've been referencing Aztec narratives and sort of creating these mural out of these like punch needle and pieces that are like, I'm trying to sort of navigate visually. And most recently, aside from that, parallel, I've been looking at sort of American history, and very specifically, something that I've never done. I think that it's very hard for me to feel a part of this country's history based on my own experiences and my identity. So then to go back and do the research and finding about gay generals that were serving in the Continental Army and sort of completely taking over those narratives and representing them as like, you know, Betsy DeVos, but like as the mother of a house, making the flag, you know, like all these beautiful things. And it's been such a like fun place to be in and to be playful. And I think that my work that's something that I try to center in my practice overall. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing so generously with us today about your work and about how you think about the way that you approach these images. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I think so. And really what comes out just readily from seeing these presentations and also just echoing some of the themes that are explored in the exhibition, just readily that these works are equally as much about celebrating and affirming as it is about calling attention to the silencing and the violence that is inflicted upon queer communities, communities of color. And so you're so eloquent, all of you, in expanding about this. I think in relation to this topic, I am drawn to a certain running theme in these presentations about the emphasis on human figures in your work, and with a shared sense of urgency in your respective works, but to very different ends, how you each refer to or render the human body or your subject at hand. So I see, for example, a play here between revealing or keeping present, for example, Joey, in your work, but also the idea of insinuating, right? In your later work, I see more of an insinuating of your subject who may not be necessarily present in the image itself, but also insinuating in your work, Troy, with through representing the clothing, right, or pieces of clothing. But then there's also a play not just with revealing and insinuating, but also obscuring, concealing, right? So leaving anonymous for us these figures who are in your likeness or your template, as you say, or also, I suppose, of your loved ones, right, as you mentioned in some of them. And I guess I wanted to ask about if you can expand more about how you're thinking about this relationship between your choice of subject matter, right, the subject that you're deciding to portray, and how you're presenting them, right, with this either presence or absence. Also because I think they ask different things of the viewer, too. So yes, if you could expand more.
Me? Go. Sorry, with this mic, I feel like a cyborg.
I know, it's really weird.
I think I'm trying to think how I can approach this. I've always been interested in the figure. First started off with like photorealistic drawing, but when I started working early on with like physique pictorial and a lot of that, I was thinking a lot about kind of the way that these idealized forms become the thing to look up to, bodies that I've never had in my life, often white bodies, but also the way that the men in these magazines are kind of allocated to these tropes, which are like the cowboy, the police officer, all these different identities. But even within this space of like sexual desire, I never saw myself represented because I felt like the bodies of color did not have the autonomy that the white figures had. Like they could be any type of anything they wanted in the magazine, but for the men of color, it was very, like if you're black, you're hood, you're like Mexican, you have a sombrero. So then I started to just really think about how I could change the setting or the scene to just give the viewer a question besides the fact that these men are here for your gaze or your consumption.
Thank you.
I think in the same sort of way, some of the first exposure I had to art were in churches, like paintings of Jesus. And so to me, that was the goal, to be a photorealist painter, which once I achieved that, I didn't know what to do with that. You know, because I think that, again, our representation is not there. And I remember even when I was an oil painter, I would paint my parents, my community. At the same time, there was I had made a painting of my father, and then the Orange Menace became president. And I remember thinking, like, well, now I almost want to, it's like the difference between I remember even like the way that it was spoken to about like, oh, that the community is hiding, or like, you know, but to me, it's like, no, you flip the power, the community chooses not to reveal itself. So I ended up making portraits of my family, but with coverings or with censorship, not because of, you know, out of fear, but more of like, that's their power. You choose when to reveal yourself. And when I started doing that work and then making portraits of myself, it was a way for me to sort of play and do these, you know, wear heels in secret, even though I was a gay man and I had my relationships in my gay community, but I felt like I was holding myself back, that I couldn't do these things, so I would do them in secret and kind of document them in painting, you know, of like, oh, if I would buy clothes or wear makeup, I was like, I'm going to do this painting of it. And I think subconsciously I would always omit the face for kind of like the same reasoning, where it's myself, but it's a shared experience. And it's both at a sense of like letting the material be itself and sort of that play of it. And I think that has kind of carried over, and now I can look back, and one of my favorite experience that I always get is when people are either collecting my work or see it, is like, oh, that's me. I had so many folks reach out to me and say like, I saw myself in your paintings, or, you know, that chubby, awkward, you know, Mexican kid body. It's like, oh, you know, I remember one of my collectors who bought I paint a lot of boxers, or I dress up as a boxer and I paint on myself. And one of the collectors reached out and was like crying on the phone and was like, I bought this piece, I saw it, like, I love it, I see it every day, you know. It's like, I always felt like the awkward, you know, chubby kid. And like, I'm so glad that I have this. And I had a similar experience. And I think that I place a lot of emphasis on like the color and tones of the figures I represent here.
You know, I was thinking about what you were saying, and then having seen what I just presented, I recognized that, you know, I started out early on, like, I want to represent my community and the intersection of the dual identity, being gay, queer, Chicano, and, you know, and with Teddy as my partner in crime, as well as other artists at the time, you know, Mundo Mesa, Jack Vargas, Jeff Huereque, and we were all looking to see what does that look like and how do we relate to that or not. And then, of course, for me, obviously, things shifted when AIDS hit the community, and I felt like, well, this is wartime, and, you know, I need to start to look at what's going on. And but I always, and this I think started when I was first studying at Immaculate Heart, that it was the idea or concept determined the medium and or how I would put together a work or a piece. There's an old joke, it's not real funny, but I don't know if you, did you hear about the conceptual artist that took a painting? Or why he did? Because he thought it was a good idea, okay? You know, and so that's why when it came time to do the portraits of friends, where I went from being just flat silk screen blocks of color to needing to be more representational and focused and details and actually painting people, who were friends, that became the direction. When it came time to show my ambivalence about surviving in the age of the AIDS cocktail and address the stigma and all of that above, I knew I couldn't do that with just the single image painting, and I chose then to take on this whole new series of still lifes. Now, part of that related to that is, I'm 44 years HIV positive, never thought I was going to live this long, and one thing that I'm very aware of, I don't want to be the artist that, like, oh, there's the artist that does the HIV, paintings, whatever. But in fact, it's like that is my history and legacy, and I want to embrace it. So I've tried to mix up each one to bring something unique or different to each. And what I've started to do is, now that we're in 2024, the work that I'm doing pays some homage to artists who died of AIDS, are no longer here. So the candies that remind me of the artist Felix Gonzalez Torres, that was done because, I don't know if folks heard about, at the exhibiting of his work in Chicago, they changed the information related to the work, where it's one of his most famous pieces, and I think it was called, named after Ross, his partner, and it was 170 pounds of candy, and whether it's in a corner, whether it's spread out, and it says related to his partner, that's how much he weighed at the time. The idea is that people are invited to go and take a piece of the candy and walk away with it, and that becomes a metaphor for the continuing loss of weight, right? Which I just always found very poignant, and it's very accessible. People that wouldn't otherwise want to look at something related to HIV or AIDS, they love, oh, look at this colorful candy, right? But they changed the description, so they just said 175 pounds of candy, the average weight of a man. They totally removed any reference to HIV or AIDS, and I was outraged, and apparently other people were too, and they, complained, and they changed it back. So that was when I said, you know what, no, I can't let that go. So that's when I chose to put candies in there and name him. And I've done that with other artists too, with David Wojnarowicz, Teddy Sandoval. So now I'm looking at, as a long-term survivor, I want to honor all those artists who didn't survive. Another, if I can just, another concept that I've started to do a series, in the current conversations going on about identity, right? And with, friends and colleagues and academics, and no, the term is Latinx, no, it's Latine, no, it's Chicanx, you should do this, you should say this, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know what? Like, there's a lot of that going on that I think really kind of misses the point. So I'm doing a series now of oil paintings, which I haven't shown here, and I think it's coming out great. And by next year, I'm going to show it. But I'm taking on the Castas genre from Mexico. It's the first time that I'm looking to Mexico for an inspiration and basis for doing work. Everything I've usually looked at was, American or Eurocentric art movements. But for those that are unfamiliar with the Castas genre, casta, which stands for caste, was, I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically 18th century Mexico. These were artists in the new Spain, the New World, who would do paintings for a European audience to show the exotic New World, and they would paint usually a man and a woman, and sometimes their child, and they would actually paint the racial categories right on the paintings themselves. And there was a value system where the most important, or those that were of most value, were the Español, the white, the European, and then they went down in status, mestizo, indio, marisco, going all the way down to negro, being the lowest rung on the social ladder. I was appalled when I saw these paintings. About 15, 16 years ago at LACMA, and I said, oh my God, I had no idea that artists had played such a role in determining these racial categorizations, and that they still continue to this day. But at the same time, I thought the paintings were so beautiful. So I was, it was a conflict for me, and I said, one day I need to try to figure out how to address that. And in 2018, I started to replicate in oil. I'm doing oil painting now. I mean, I'm a big, acrylic person, but I'm painting people that I know, and I'm letting them tell me. I said, I will paint you, and reflecting like the Costa genre, but I want you to tell me, how do you want to be labeled for your ethnic identity, and because it's the 21st century, your gender identity and or sexual orientation, or not, whatever you're most comfortable with. And if you want to put your lineage with who your parents or grandparents were or anything, I'll put it in there. And I'm Pocho, I don't speak Spanish, but I'm replicating those paintings, so I'm doing the lettering in Spanish. So it's an additional challenge for me as a Chicano on this side of the border. And anyway, I think it's turning out great. So yeah.
Well, I'm excited to see them. This actually brings up in a way that I wasn't anticipating, but this way that you're reorienting, for example, a Costa painting and oil painting itself, and the layering of references. I think this actually leads into something that I wanted to ask all of you about, right? And it's a word that has come up in the mic. In the presentations, but then is also very much present in the exhibition itself, which is the word collage, right? And I want to delve a little bit more deeply into this notion of queering collage, or perhaps how you're, better yet, mining the idea of collage as queer already, because it reorients and destabilizes certain value systems or certain structures that are built into an image. And I see that there is collage in your work in one way or another in terms of the process or aesthetic. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to how you approach collage in your practice.
I think for me, it's mostly, my practice tends to be intuitive in like the materials that I collect. So I use a lot of faux fur, sequin. Like if I see a fabric somewhere that I love, like get a bolt of that or whatever. Because then when I'm making, it's like, that's kind of where like I'm reaching for all these things. I've collected a lot of like applique, sequins, rhinestones, and I think that visually my images are sort of modeled and like studio shot, but then the like adding of almost like this assemblage at the end that happens, it's like, to me sometimes that's the painting aspect, where it's like these floral rhinestones that I had for 2 years. It's like now I can, it's appropriate to like stick those on, and I think that maybe that sort of improvisation, I relate a lot even to like getting your makeup done, or like when you're hanging out with friends, or like going to the club. It's like, you're borrowing your mom's shoes, you're wearing your friend's makeup, you bought that dress that day, and it's like, like I find all of that magic in those times, or like that sort of like disheveled, sort of put together, but like all of this feels cheap, but it's very glamorous at the same time. That I think that's how I relate to the assembling of my paintings.
I guess how I use collage in my work, or I guess one of the things I love about it is I feel like it's an instinctual thing. It's democratic. You don't need fancy materials to make collage, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was always drawn more to that than painting in that way, because I didn't want, so much of my education was the Western canon of painting, but what I like about collage is you're using oftentimes materials that everyday people, even without a certain education, can understand. Mine happened to be pornography. But yeah, so it's this like way of like a democratic process, but I think intuition is huge, and I think that takes time. So for a long time I would overwork because I'm impatient, and now I just have learned, like, let the material usage kind of guide me. But for me, it's also like this way of telling stories. I think very much about layering and I guess, small brief story. So in undergrad, I was an artifact sketch artist for TRC Environmental. And so we got to go to these archaeological sites in New Mexico and in West Texas. And it was just one of those jobs that I knew that that whole experience, because they often gave me the paperwork, was going to be important. But I just remember when you have that archaeological square and then you go down the centimeters and centimeters and centimeters, I think about that, but kind of in the reverse. So it's kind of like, what's the first layer of history, or applique or image, but I also enjoy the kind of risk in that. Like once something gets glued, I'm okay if it ends up being covered up again. So I think that's something that I enjoy about it.
So there's two ways that I think I've used collage, and I'll focus first on some of the work that's here in this exhibit, and this was something that Teddy and I used to do, and we'd spend hours doing it and have fun. But we would look at newspapers, magazines, and there's a piece here in this exhibit, and it's an advertisement for men's clothing, I think from Bullock's department store or something, but from the newspaper. But we would look at illustrations of males, and we would then put mustaches on them, or we'd darken their hair, so we would Latinize or Mexicanize them. But at the same time, because of the gay culture and the clone, the mustache became, a symbol for, gay male identity. So we were doing two things with that, and we used to love doing that and have lots of fun. We did it a lot. The other way that I know I've used collage is in the still life series that I've been doing. One of my intentions was to create a visual image that played with the idea of reality and unreality. I mean, it took me years to recognize that, I'm not going to die from AIDS. It seems so unreal. It seems surreal. So I would intentionally mix, collage, imagery along with painted imagery, along with pasting everything from, Mardi Gras beads, as you can see in the diptych that's here in the museum, to crocheted pot holders, to antique advertisements, and to create a sense of enigmatic challenges that some people would relate to in a way. But again, collage allowed me to be playful like that. So and it wasn't the same as when I was putting mustaches on, male advertisements. But and I love collage, and the collage was also an essential component of the mail art that we would do, the postcards, back and forth, and we just had an excellent little workshop today doing postcards, and that was really fun. So thank you, Eric, and. So I don't know if that...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can see the richness of how you each approach it in terms of recontextualizing, reframing, reimagining, using it as a tool for world making also. I just realized the time, so I wanted to open it up to the audience too, if anyone has any questions for our panelists. I want to make sure we have time for that. So I open the floor.
Well, we may have done such a good job of explaining everything that there's no questions.
There's one.
I guess we didn't do a good job.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is to Mr. Terrill. You spoke about your trip to Mexico and how inspiring it was for you, and I'm just wondering if, have you been back, and have you been back to Mexico City? Are there any particular neighborhoods that you take inspiration from? And I was a visitor to Mexico City, and it was one of the most wonderful places I've ever been. And I have so many fond memories, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more of yours.
Okay, so I think that was like 3 questions, and I would say yes, yes, and yes. No, so that first time I was 15 years old, and my uncle Rudy, who was just one of the most wonderful people in the world. He came from El Paso, Texas. He was a former Pachuco. He married my aunt. And he did not have a lot, I don't think he went beyond high school in terms of his education, but to me, he was one of the wisest men in terms of the way he engaged with people and humans. And he always made me feel, accepted and like, let Joey be Joey. And he wants to do coloring with the crayon, that's fine. But in that summer, back in 1971, when we were going to go, my mom said, we're going to go down to Mexico. We're going to take 2 weeks, and we're going to drive all the way down. And I was like, oh, Mom, do we have to? I was like, I want to, it's summer. I want to be with my friends here in LA and whatever. And we went, and I didn't want to come back. I was like, oh, my gosh, and we stopped we went to Guadalajara, we went to Aguascalientes, Torreon, we went all to these different places, and then drove back up to Mazatlan before we went through Tijuana. But, the final destination was Mexico City. And to be frank, at that point in time, I was astounded that here were these big, buildings and beautiful architecture. And I saw all these people walking around in business suits and women dressed up and everything. And they're all Mexicans. I was used to, when I saw that in LA, they were mostly white people. So it was a real eye-opener for me and expanded my view of what Mexico was, but specifically Mexico City. And then I had the opportunity to go back in my HIV advocacy days, where we went for the International AIDS Conference held in Mexico City, 2008, I think it was, and to march with 20,000 advocates, LGBTQ, women, socialists, just people involved in health through the Reforma. I mean, it was just a highlight of my life. And, and I was able to engage with all these other people from other countries. And I remember taking 2 women from Africa, I think they were from Kenya, under my wing and saying, well, I'm Chicano, I'm really from LA, but here, let me show you around Mexico City. I became their little tour guide, and it was so great to see Mexico City through their eyes, and go eat and whatever. And then in 2022, gosh, it's already 24. I had the opportunity to go down because a very good friend of mine, who was part of our whole crew that is represented in this exhibit, Roberto Galamontes, who was from Mexico, but very early on he grew up in East LA, so he really adopted a Chicano identity, and we all grew up together. He was having a solo show at Curry Manzuro Gallery in Mexico City, and that was a major event, and there were about 30 of us who were all friends of his from New York to San Francisco, and then a whole bunch of us from LA, and that included Patsy Valdez and Jeff Huereque and Luis Sampao, and we all said, let's all go and support him. And I said, yes, and we went down to Mexico City, and we had the best time ever, and the Curry Manzuro Gallery itself was worth the trip. It's more like a huge center for research and art, and they made us feel so welcome. And Roberto's art, I was thrilled to see it now being on the international global stage, right? And the role that Curry Manzuro and Mexico City played in that. And we stayed in La Condesa, and I loved the neighborhood. I mean, and would just spend times allowing myself to wander, look around, get lost, so to speak. And then, of course, doing all the museums and the Teatro de Bellas Artes, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful time. And I'm looking forward to going next year, where I'm going to take my cousin Ryan, who's now 26 years old, and he's never been to Mexico. Okay, and he really has been out of touch with Mexican culture, and he is so excited, and I am too. I'm more like an uncle to him because I'm third cousin. But yeah, so I've been on Instagram, and I keep sending him like the 10 best restaurants in Mexico City, and the art galleries in Mexico City, the Reforma, this and that, and he's just like so I guess, yeah, the answer is yes. Sure. Yeah.
Maybe you can share it with all of us.
No, and I really do think that, Mexico City has, if it hasn't always been, it's certainly now a really magical place. And I get that whole sense of coming from the United States where it's just very different, because there, the history and the culture and the art is all ingrained in the everyday. You could talk to the taxi cab driver and they know exactly where the museums are and they know where to direct you. And I would love to actually go and live there for a while. And I know some artists there now, and they've been telling me like, hey, you want to come down for a year, come down for 6 months? So, I'll let you know next year what happens. No, thank you for asking.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking in such a beautiful and accessible way about your art. I have a question that's kind of for all of you. Moises, you mentioned this relationship between, is this sounding weird? This relationship between queerness and play, and I loved that. I wrote it down right away, and it made me think of the way each of you was speaking about your art. And like, Joy, I love that you talk about being partners in crime with Teddy Sandoval, and Troy talking about materials and not being so precious with them, I think stood out to me. But I wondered if any of you wanted to kind of expand on how play functions in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I recognize that my art practice is like my cheap therapy, for myself. And I'm an artist that definitely feels like the duality of like art that I want to make versus art that I feel responsible to make, as like I have a platform and I can speak on these things. And being playful was something that when I started making my glitter bricks, I wasn't even going to show them. I would be making them in secret because I felt like this overarching pressure to be like, why are you having fun? You're making art, or like, why are you dedicating to this aspect of yourself that like, there's bigger priorities. I have more important insecurities regarding my family and like their documentation. Until I had reached a boiling point that I was like, that's how I'll survive, like having this playful look and like having material. The subject matter is always going to be sad. Like I think that but the work doesn't have to be, like I don't have to be always in this like, especially if we make work about our experiences, there's happiness there. It's easy to make work about the sad stuff, but we kind of have to remind ourselves about the other things that brought pleasure to our lives, and play and sensuality are super important to me. So I think that by having these materials and just having these ideas and these absurd, the work is already absurd. Like I'm playing with glitter. Like that's how silly you can get. So, but there is like, that kind of allows me to always have fun and kind of obsess over these materials that I think I'll still be obsessing over them, because how can you not? I don't know. That's how I trick myself.
That's how I trick.
To make work.
I guess I would say the same. I mean, I was thinking of this comment one of these people I don't really care for anymore from grad school made. And they were just like, why do you always make work about race and whatever? We're post-colonial now. And I'm like, okay, I didn't get that memo.
You're like, love that for you.
Yeah, I'm like, what?
I love that for you.
But yeah, I think I had that moment where play for me is in the juxtaposition, the color usage. I don't know. I think it's all materially driven. And it's not easy sometimes to go into the studio and it's like, let me unmine the history of slavery or the history of like the braceros or all these other dark histories. But for me, it also becomes such a labor of love because I'm so invested in trying to retell them in a way that isn't exactly going to be historical. But I think that's kind of the play the way, like I'm mixing kind of these queer pornographic magazines with like very hardcore like pachucos, and that's kind of a narrative that I feel like is not
That's playful.
mainstream.
And I think also sometimes, especially being like an artist of color, like you feel guilty sort of like playing, like I grew up very poor. So even with I'm so like, I hoard everything in my materials, and like I feel so like, I remember I used to beat myself up if something wasn't successful in regards to like my, like is it looking good or whatever. But I remember I would have my like queer family, and they would just be like, it's not that serious. Like you're like, I mean, you're in your studio, like there's things going on, and I think that letting go of that guilt, because you feel things so fiercely outside of your studio, your practice, that you want to like tear down walls and like rebuild them, but it's like, it's okay. Like your role, whether it's an artist, activist, is to find the play in it, like, so I don't know. I think that I feel that so fiercely sometimes.
So I got to tell you, you got to forgive me because my brain doesn't work like it used to, and I'm forgetting the person that I got the quote from, but this was way early on, I think in the 70s. And I think there's a similar quote attributed to Oscar Wilde, but it goes along the lines of, art is too important to be taken seriously. Okay, and that's always stuck with me. And that was sort of the spirit of what we were doing with the male art, right? But it could be as silly, as erotic, as blatant, as kooky, crazy, that however we could imagine it. But also in terms of the use of collage and use of assemblage and things that you could juxtapose things that don't necessarily go together and are playful. And then for me, Halloween was my favorite holiday, always, since I was a kid. Like, to be able to, for me, see even adults dress up and act silly and, and get drunk and be playful. You didn't get that at Thanksgiving. You didn't get that at Christmas. Whatever. So I always loved Halloween. And when I was doing the Halloween parties, that was a part of it. It was about come and play. And I would do the invitations, and they were variations of like the psychedelic posters from the 60s. But it would always say, if you read it correctly, like, here's a time, blah, 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 and costume mandatory, bring your own hallucinogenics. It was, and that was, and I meant it. And then people, I would be there talking to people like, hi, are you okay? Like, yeah, I'm just, and I recognize and say, great, have a ball. If you need anything, let me know. And to me, making art should be joyful. It should be playful, even when you're making work that's very serious. And that's just me. So, yeah, I think, especially being queer, you have to bring playfulness into it at some level, at some point. So.
Especially because I feel like we chose this. It's like self-inflicting, It's like we should be having fun. I don't know. That was so important to me. Yeah, I love play. We should have fun. I don't know.
Well, that's as beautiful a place that we could end on. So thank you all so much for your
Thank you.
generosity.
Thank you.
Thank you all.